Let's begin this session with a discussion about the origin and the history of the field that's identified as system dynamics. Maybe we should go around and see who has either questions or observations, and then I will give you my view of how this field got started. Who would like to make some opening questions or comments?
There's actually two that are really on my mind, and both relate to things that came up in the first part of the session. When you showed us a graphic of the glass of water filling up, you made the assertion that all actions, anytime, any place, anywhere, are controlled through feedback or within feedback loops. That's a very powerful assertion, and I wonder if anyone has ever challenged that, or if there's ever been, although we can't really prove it, any attempt made to really demonstrate how widely applicable that claim is. So that's one question. The second one is, it kind of relates a little to something Nelson said earlier, which is that once we teach people to think about the world through stocks and flows, and that those are really the only two types of variables that exist in systems, they never see the world differently. I think that's a profound insight, and I'm extremely curious to sort of understand how that emerged, where it came from, what led you to sort of the realization that that happens, and you know, more so the issue of integration versus differentiation as it relates to how you model those stocks. So I hope we can get into that as we discuss this.
The thing I'd really be curious to know more about is, again, as we talked about in the first session, the notion of modeling, but in particular the fact that people have mental models and that is the basis for most of the decision-making that happens. The idea that system dynamics could be a tool to improve those mental models shows up in the earliest writings of the field, and certainly in industrial dynamics. And I would imagine, not having been there, that was a fairly radical idea, particularly in the engineering circles where you had your background. So I'd be very interested in A, where you got the idea of mental models and the idea that that really was the high leverage point for improvement, and B, what the initial reaction was about that notion from some of your more engineering-minded colleagues when you first started to develop the field.
I was particularly that is a hard word for me, interested in finding out more about feedback. I mean, we haven't talked much about positive and balancing feedback, but I think that also ties around that there are only two sorts of variables. There are only two sorts of feedbacks, but it's enough to generate all types of behaviors, and I would like to address that. And in relating to what Nelson just said about implementation and how people change their mental models, oftentimes we hear people saying that the model was led to insights, but still people didn't change their behavior in the long run. And I just find that implementation is something that we take for granted, not only for social structures, but for especially for mental models, how we think about things and actually change our behavior.
I think I'd like to focus a set of questions in a different direction, and they're more personally oriented toward you and your life path. When I look at you, I see a phenomenal innovator, someone who is not only in this field but in a few different fields taken a phenomenal step, taken the whole field a phenomenal step forward with the way that you've thought differently about a situation at hand. And I'm curious what sort of policies you have in your head and that ordain your actions that enable you to do that.
You mentioned in your autobiography some of the related streams of science and related work under the headings of cybernetics and others, and I'd be very interested to know how you saw those other fields developing alongside or failing to develop alongside of system dynamics, and what interactions there have been over time.
In your autobiography, you also talk about your growing up on a ranch. And you make this statement in a couple of different articles we read that everything in your history has led you or sort of culminated in system dynamics. And I have heard another story that we didn't read about you, when someone asked you, how could you be so courageous in that moment? And you said, well, I knew I could always go back to the ranch. And I'm curious about how the ranch not only shaped what you valued and how you went about your work, but also how its presence over your whole life has affected and influenced your work.
Yeah, I have two questions actually. The first one is just generally system dynamics deals with dynamic problems. So by getting into system dynamics field, we're not studying static problems. So do you think that static problems are just not existent in our field of interest, just generally in our lives, or that they're too simple and you weren't satisfied with the results and you moved to dynamic problems? And the second question is just, as we know about your history, that you started to implement system dynamics at Sloan School of Management. And is it the reason why you started to deal with management systems, or could you envision yourself studying system dynamics in the field of medicine, for example, where they don't really have lots of analytical problems, methods, I guess? So these are two questions I would like